Welcome to our monthly lecture in the series Flight or Fight, Stories of Artists Under Repression. I'm Rachel Stern, Director and CEO of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized and Banned Art based in New York. We research, discuss, publish and exhibit artists whose life and work were affected by the German Nazi regime between 1933 and 1945. With this work, we commemorate their lives and achievements. 2 weeks ago, Dr. Dorothea Schöne spoke about the artist Hans Ullman and the prison diaries he created between 1933 and 1935. Today, we'll hear more about artists like Hans Ullman, artists who stayed in Germany between 1933 and 1945, but did not seek or find any affiliation with the National Socialist regime. I'm honored to welcome Dr. Ilka Voermann, who studied art history, classical archaeology, and modern and contemporary history in Münster and Mainz. Between 2011 and 2013, Ilka Voermann worked initially as a research assistant and subsequently as curator at the Kunstmuseum Stuttgart. After teaching positions at Stuttgart University and the State Academy of Fine Arts in Stuttgart, she was employed from 2014 to 17 as curatorial fellow at the Harvard Art Museums in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Ilka Voermann has authored numerous texts and catalog contributions for all the exhibitions she has organized, especially on the subjects of new objectivity and art in Germany from 1945. She has also written monographic essays on artists, including Otto Dix, Christian Schad, Fritz Winter, Willy Baumeister, Adolf Hölzel, Sigmar Polke, and Chuck Close. Dr. Ilka Voermann has been curator at the Schirn Kunsthalle Frankfurt since July 2017, where she curated the large overview exhibition Art for No One, 1933 to 45. Welcome, Ilka.
Thank you. Thank you for having me and giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about the exhibition, which is currently on view at the Schirn Kunsthalle. So shall I just begin?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So as you already mentioned, the exhibition Art for No One, or Kunst für keinen, as it's called in German, focuses on artists who remained in Germany after 1933, but whose work was rejected by the National Socialist regime. Many of them nevertheless continued working, but without any prospect of their works being exhibited or seen. And that's also why the exhibition has been called Art for No One, because it was made without a public, you can say, in mind. Unfortunately, this art for no one in some ways is still not really visible today. Apart from a few fine exceptions, only very few museums have taken note of the artists who did not go into exile after 1933. And the reasons for this are quite understandable, since those who remained in Germany elude contextualization of their works with respect to ethics. And based on their works themselves and a few contemporary statements, because we always have to be a little careful about statements that were made after 1945, it is often quite hard to learn more or much about their internal attitude towards the National Socialist regime. Okay. So before I talk about the exhibition at the Schirn right now, I would like to point out a few exhibitions, or two exhibitions actually, which have shown two exhibitions from the recent years, which have shown how vital it is to critically examine the careers of artists during the period of National Socialism in order to obtain a differentiated picture of the time. And the two exhibitions I would like to mention are first the Emil Nolde exhibition at the Hamburger Bahnhof. The exact title was Emil Nolde, a German legend, the artist during the Nazi regime, which was at the Hamburger Bahnhof Museum für Gegenwart in Berlin in 2019. And the second exhibition is the exhibition called Escape into Art, the Brücke painters in the Nazi period at the Brücke Museum Berlin. And they were both happening quite at the same time. So they were parallel exhibitions. And these two projects were very important for me because they both illustrated that the long practice juxtapositions of defamed art on the one hand and conformist Nazi art on the other is no longer sustainable. And that the antithetical narrative of good and bad art, which ultimately goes back to National Socialist cultural politics, was taken up after 1945, albeit in reserve, and became ethically loaded. Therefore, it's not only problematic that the division into defamed art on the one hand and Nazi art on the other simplifies a much more complex historical reality. This juxtaposition is also based on a notion that there has been a fixed National Socialist canon and also a counter canon, which did not exist. So here we have a look into the current exhibition at the Schirn. This is actually the first room. So if you would come to the Schirn and see the show, this would be the first room to see. It highlights the works by the Berlin artist John Marman, who was the topic of a talk a couple of months ago, if I'm correct. And yeah, so this is, so the main thing when I started planning the show was the main issue I had was how to structure a show that's focused on such a very, very large, but also very complicated group of artists. And despite doing it chronologically or by themes, my idea was to focus on biographies. The problem with focusing on biographies is of course that you can only focus on a very small number of artists. But the advantage is that you can really dig deep into their biography, into the circumstances of their lives, and also you have the opportunity to really show what the circumstances were and why probably they made decisions they did, and maybe decided things that sometimes seems, when you do it on a very superficial level, irritating, but when you focus on one biography, you really have the opportunity to get to know the artist, but also the work itself. And I found that's really important because the artists who lived in Germany during this period and were not accepted by the regime were in fact marginalized for quite a variety of reasons. And often these reasons had not much to do with their art per se, but were instead related to their religion, their background, their sexual orientation, or their political beliefs. And I think this marginalization must also be differentiated and considered in more detail on a case-to-case basis, since not everyone who made use of the term defamation after 1945 ended up being persecuted. So, and that's what we are trying in this exhibition. Furthermore, it's also important to mention that the circumstances such as popularity, national and international networks of the artists, but also gender, also affected the scope of actions that were open to artists in National Socialist Germany. So before we look a little bit more into the art itself, I would like to talk a little bit about the art political background. Oh no, before I'm just missed one slide. Because I'm always talking about biographies. These are actually the artists we are showing in this exhibition. So we limited it down to 14. And those are Willy Baumeister, Otto Dix, Hans Grundig, Lea Grundig, Werner Held, Hannah Höch, Martha Höpfner, Kahufa, Edmund Kesting, Jean Marman, Ernst Willem Ney, Franz Gratzev, Hans Ullman, and Fritz Winter. And this selection should not in any way be regarded as complete. it is these are a number of examples that stands representatively for a larger number of artists' careers, mediums, and artistic forms of expression. And when I made this selection, one thing that was really important for me was to have a large variety of biographies, but also a large variety of artistic expressions. So not only works on paper, but paintings, photography, and also a little bit of sculpture, because one of the stereotypes about this period is that the art is quite dull and dark and not very creative. So it was important for me to have a larger variety and show that despite the circumstances, artists were able to really create astonishing and great works. Okay, so but now I'm coming to the historical or art political background. So here you can see the organigram of the Reichschamber of Culture, the Reichskulturkammer. And this was the central institution for controlling any form of cultural work in the National Socialist state. And as a governmental body, the Reichskammer of the Reichschamber of Culture was under the direct control of Joseph Goebbels' Reichsministerium für Volksaufklärung und Propaganda, the Reichsministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. And it was divided up into 7 lower chambers for the fields of art, theater, music, literature, film, radio, and the press. And for the German artists, the fine artists, the Reichschamber of Fine Arts, the Reichskammer der Bildenden Künste, was responsible. So from the outside, the chamber seemed to be a professional association responsible for supporting and promoting cultural occupations. But its real purpose was to register and monitor all individuals working in the area of culture in National Socialist Germany. And it's really interesting that the fact that the membership was not voluntary, but was instead required by law, already shows that this is not an ordinary professional association, but actually a controlling instrument that was established by the National Socialists. So only artists who were members of the chamber could practice their profession publicly. So for the visual artists, this included in particular exhibiting their works publicly, but also sell their works through galleries or auction houses. And what's also quite interesting or very important, especially in the 1940s, is that only members of the chamber were publicly allowed to obtain artistic materials. But we will talk about this a little bit later. Okay. Whoops. Here we go. So to be accepted as a member, it was necessary to fill out a 2-page form. And here you can see the application form, or the first page of the application form of the Berlin artist Werner Held, which is still in the Landesarchiv Berlin. And in this form, you had to add a number of data, especially concerning your biography, but it also required information on your education, on party memberships, political party memberships, and also on your family situation. Moreover, the artist also had to submit works of art, so at least photographies or photographs of them. But unfortunately, I had no case where these photographs survived in the files. So there's often the talk about showing art or showing the photograph to the authorities at the chamber. But as far as I know, there are no surviving photographs, or in the case of the artist I did my research on, there's no proof what they actually have shown. So this is an interesting kind of like gap in this research, and I'm pretty sure it's not really certain if we could ever close this gap or close this little little hole of knowledge, but it would be super interesting to see what they actually showed the chamber as their work. But what's very interesting, and you can already find in the literature around the Reichskulturkammer, this data and this facts, but it was also proven right by the research I did on this for this exhibition, that the professional competence, so the way the artist worked and the formal style was not the most important criteria for becoming a member of the chamber. What was much more important was the so-called proof of Aryan heritage, with which the applicants had to prove that they had no so-called non-Aryan ancestors for at least the past 3 generations. That was something that was not only required for the Reichskulturkammer, but also other institutions. But here it also became one of the most important documents you had to fill out and give to the chamber. And as of 1936, this proof had not only be provided for yourself, so for the applicant, but also for his or her spouse. So that was the official way of entering the chamber, but most members were, however, not accepted via this official route, but instead as a result of the enforced conformity of professional associations. And because many professional associations like the Deutsche Künstlerbund were dissolved, and as of 1933, their members were transferred to the Reichschamber. And the goal of this process was, of course, to achieve a comprehensive registry of cultural life in the National Socialist Germany as quickly as possible. And the National Socialists could also kind of publicly sell the Reichskulturkammer as a huge success, which gained thousands of members during the first year. Nevertheless, all these members had to be vetted afterwards and needed to hand in supporting documents. So this whole process was indeed pretty long and pretty complicated, but it also explains a few interesting facts, like, for example, in the first years after the establishment of the chamber, there has been a number of Jewish artists who were also members of the Reichschamber of Fine Arts. And this can only be explained by the takeover of members from dissolved associations, because these Jewish members were, of course, systematically thrown out in the following years due to the lack of the so-called proof of Aryan heritage. When someone was excluded from the Reichschamber of Fine Arts, a ban on working and exhibiting was usually imposed. And this could also be monitored in special cases by the Gestapo. In many biographies published after 1945, there is a lot of talk about bans on painting, exhibiting, and practicing one's profession. And sometimes when you look into these biographies, you get the impression that nearly every modern artist who lived in Germany was forbidden to work during the National Socialist era. But the often misleading term painting ban, or in German Malverbot, is obviously an invention of the post-war period, because the bans imposed by the chamber applied only to practicing one's profession publicly. So no one could really monitor if you were painting at home, painting in your studio, or doing a sculpture or drawing. It was only really possible to monitor what was happening on a public level. Let's see the next, here we go. The occupational ban that is so frequently mentioned in post-war biographies was actually imposed quite rarely. Among the artists represented in the exhibition, Art for No One, a ban on practicing, the full ban on practicing, because there were also bans only for solo exhibitions or exhibitions, but a complete occasional ban can only be established in the case of Hans Grundig and Kahufa. And Hans Grundig, you can see in a photo from around 1940, shortly before he was arrested and interned in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Hans Grundig was a Dresden painter and draftsman, and he was a very political person, a very political artist, who was a member of the Communist Party of Germany, the KPD, from the 1920s. And he has been excluded from the Reichschamber in 1936. We know this from a letter he has written to a friend in which he explains what had happened to him. But this letter does not mention the specific reasons for his exclusion. But it is very likely that what tipped the scale of was not his art, but rather his affiliation with the Communistic Party of Germany and his association with other leftist groups in Dresden. And also the fact that his wife, Lea Grundig, who was also the topic of a recent talk of the Fritz Ascher Society, the fact that she came from a Jewish family was probably also played a significant role in his exclusion. The other artist who was excluded or from the Reichschamber and got an occupational ban was Kahufa, who we can here see in a photo in his studio in 1934. And Hofer's story is actually quite interesting because the occupational ban was in effect only for a few weeks, and it was also not related to his art. The reason for him being thrown out was his marriage to a Jewish woman, and Hofer was not admitted to the chamber again until he provided evidence of having divorced his wife. So it's also an example that it was possible to become a member again if you provided the documents, or if you changed your circumstances, like Hofer did in this case. In the related literature, it's also often suggested that there have been some categorical occupational bans. So, for example, artists who were dismissed from teaching posts in 1933, that they were categorically excluded, but this is also not true, as the examples of Otto Dix, Willy Baumeister, and also Karl Hofer show. And also the same applies for artists whose works were confiscated as part of the Action Entartete Kunst, or degenerate art, and the subsequent defamation of them in the exhibition of the same name. Also, these artists were not categorically excluded, as the example of Ernst Willem Ney shows. We can see Ernst Willem Ney here in a very beautiful photograph of him on the Lofoten in Norway, where he spent a couple of months in 1937 and 1938. And this trip was actually pretty influential for the development of his work. And it's really interesting that there is in his member file at the Landesarchiv in Berlin, there is a correspondence or an assessment of his artistic abilities, from which we can learn that the Reichschamber definitely knew that his work was presented in the famous Munich exhibition, Degenerate Art, but that it played only a minor role in the assessment of his artistic abilities. And I'm quoting from this document, which is from 1933. Ney was represented at the time in the exhibition Entartete Kunst, but based on his photos of landscapes presented here, he can be classified as a still quite idiosyncratic, but no longer degenerate painter. his works make it possible to conclude that he is making earnest efforts to examine the artistic requirements specified, though based on a somewhat esoteric position. So unfortunately, we don't know what what kind of works Nye showed the Reichschamber. Just to let you know what kind of landscape paintings and landscape drawings he did in the late 1930s. This is a quite typical example of his so-called Lofoten landscapes, which he created in the late 1930s based on the impressions he got from his time in Norway. And some scholars have suggested that he submitted a landscape painting like this, but I would say this is rather unlikely. But we can only guess what he showed the Reichschamber. But it's really interesting that his that the fact that he was shown at the exhibition and Arte de Kunst played no significant role in the assessment of his artistic abilities. When I looked into these different documents and did my research on the memberships in the Reichschamber, I often ask myself why so many artists still were members of the Reichschamber. Because on the first view, it seemed to me that being a member was not really an advantage, because being a member was, of course, it was required by law for working publicly, but most artists in the show, although they were members, didn't have any opportunity to show their works. So it was not like if you were a member, you were guaranteed to be shown. And also the works they were creating were definitely not something that would have been shown in an exhibition like the Große Deutsche Kunstausstellung, which was the big Nazi art exhibition in Munich, which was presented parallel to the Degenerate Arts exhibition. So what was the advantage of being a member? And what might have appealed to a lot of the artists was that, so where's the next slide? Membership. Here we go. Membership offered assistance with a lot of day-to-day things like getting work material, which could only be obtained with coupons, which applies particularly to the years of war. And here you can see one of those so-called Bezugsschein, those purchasing art material coupons, which were given to the artists by the Reichschamber of Fine Arts. And especially in the 1940s, this became, for a lot of artists, the only source of artistic material. Membership could also be an advantage in connection with the allocation of studios. And many artists also benefited from financial support. So Ernst Wilhelm Nye, which the artist we saw in the slide before, for instance, received a one-time financial assistance of 50 Reichsmark in 1936. And also Kahufa applied for compensation for after his studio was completely destroyed by a bombing raid in 1944. So the chamber also took care of things like this, and a lot of artists actually benefited from these different ways of assistance on a day-to-day basis. So the next topic I would like to talk about is, because this historical background I think is really important, also extremely interesting, because here you can see how inconsistent the system was, how inconsistent the rules were followed by the chamber, and also the possibilities of maybe tricking the chamber by showing them works that would appeal to the authorities. There, as you can see, there are still a lot of question marks, but it also, I think it also shows that especially when it comes to the artists who lost their positions or the artists who were shown in the degenerate art show in Munich. They were still members of the chamber, so there is definitely a lack of consistency in the art politics when it comes to the Reichskammer der Bildenden Künste. But I want to move away from this historical background, although I think it's extremely interesting, and there's still a lot of things we need to research. But for the second part, I would like to focus on the way we talk about the art from this period, and especially one specific term, which is also often used when we talk about artists who stayed in Germany between 1933 and 55. And that's the term inner emigration, as a kind of opposite to the real exile, to the people who actually left Germany in the 30s and 40s. The term, so we have to move into the field of literature now, because the term inner immigration was coined by a very publicly conducted debate between the two authors, Frank Thies, who's not very well known anymore today, and the very, very well-known Thomas Mann, in the summer of 1945. The starting point was the letter by another author by the name Walter von Molo, which was printed in a Hessian newspaper in August 1945. And in this letter, he urges Thomas Mann, who was living in exile in the United States, to return to Germany. And Mann had actually no plans to return at this point, and had previously made very critical statements about literature that was produced in National Socialist Germany. And he also made a lot of statements of the collective guilt of the Germans. But Mann didn't really have the chance to publish his public reaction, because Frank Thies joined the debate with an article with the title Die innere Emigration, the inner immigration. And in it, he accused Mann as a representative for all authors in exile of fleeing and cowardice, and called for a recognition of the inner immigration of those who stayed and endured in National Socialist Germany. And Thies associated this inner immigration with a frame of mind that remained untouched by the ideology of the National Socialist state, at least according to his own assessment. And his argument is quite problematic and clearly shaped by a desire to justify his own actions. There was no comparable debate about exile and inner immigration among visual artists, nor was the term itself used for a long time in connection with the visual arts. But the associated image of the artist who did not allow him or herself to be influenced by the ideology of the National Socialist state, and who continued to work tirelessly, was adopted for the visual arts, and especially propagated by Werner Haftmann, probably the most famous post-war art historian in Germany, whose biography we all know has to be rewritten after the discoveries of his own affiliation with the National Socialist regime. But for the use of the term inner immigration, and for framing this idea of an artist fighting, although withdrawing at the same time, Haftmann is a very important figure. And in his book Verfemte Kunst, Defamed Art, he wrote, I quote, "The artist was thus completely alone in this political turmoil. The only thing left for him was the role of a lone fighter in opposition to the totalitarian demon. He was not assisted by any collective, but merely knew of other lone fighters here and there. He engaged in the struggle as a lone fighter left to fend for himself, positioned the struggle on the art-appropriate foundations of perseverance and quality, and thus won." End of quote. And it's really interesting, I think, the kind of language Haftmann uses here. So it's a very military, very forceful language. And is very, very interesting because he's also trying to draw a picture of a non-political, isolated individual that continued to fight against the regime and interpreted this position as a form of resistance. And this is, of course, a quite problematic definition, especially since Haftmann, with this idea of an inner immigrant, also generalizes and romanticizes the reality of life for numerous artists during the National Socialist period. But one of the reasons why this term inner immigration, also the image that is connected to it, was so successful is, I guess, it provided the West Germany, or the Federal Republic of Germany, and their politics of culture and remembrance with an identity-forming narrative of the good Germans who stayed in Germany but who did not affiliate themselves with the National Socialists. The notion of this isolated existence has, of course, some truth in it, and is also something that's not only a term or an image that we can find in the post-war discussions about German art, but it's also something that we can find in various statements in journals and letters which were written in the 1930s and 40s. And I would like to quote the Stuttgart-based artist Willy Baumeister here, who wrote in his journal in 1941, I quote, "It's very quiet in the studio. At the same time, it's not easy to endure the depression of this time, and this for 7 years already. I will likely never be able to show my pictures in exhibitions again. I thus work for myself alone," end of quote. And although Baumeister is not using the term exile or immigration or inner immigration, it is very clear that this isolation and lonesomeness is definitely something that that also fits into this idea of inner immigration. In this context, we also have to ask the question why so many artists actually stayed in Germany. And it's actually quite impossible to answer these questions because the reasons for staying were pretty various. And we can find vague considerations of leaving Germany in many letters and journal entries. But the intention to go into exile was also linked to great anxiety, especially regarding ensuring a livelihood and also language barriers. So specifically those artists, and these are the ones presented in this exhibition, whose life were not actually threatened, often chose to remain in Germany. But many of them did, however, withdraw from public artistic life. And but the interesting thing is that withdrawing from public life, from society, from artistic circles, is not necessarily connected or does not necessarily mean that the artist had no knowledge of the day-to-day events or did not react to them. And so Haftmann's image of the tirelessly working artist existing cut off from the outside world does not prove to be sustainable in these cases as well. If we look at Willy Baumeister, whom I quoted just a minute before, he is one of the artists who has long been regarded as one of the typical non-political withdrawn artists from the 1930s and 40s, and who was not interested in what happened around him at all. It was working in an abstract manner, and was not really interested in what was happening around him. But this can be proven wrong, and I have to give credit to Peter Schamatski, who was the first one who pointed this series of works out. It's a series of postcards he purchased at the Große Deutsche Kunstausstellung in Munich in the late 1930s. As I mentioned before, the Große Deutsche Kunstausstellung was the kind of official National Socialist art exhibition, which took place in the Haus der Deutschen Kunst, which is today the Haus der Kunst. And Baumeister, whose work were presented in the Degenerate Art Show, also went there. And there he also bought these postcards. So for the work you can see here, Baumeister made use of one of those postcards with a motif by the National Socialist painter Adolf Ziegler. And by the means of overpainting, he altered the picture of a goddess in such a way that this beauty became a man's head. The two breasts become the two eyes, and the pubic hair becomes a goatee. And of course, you can say when you look at this, this is quite a kind of like low joke, but but there are a lot of hints that, or a lot of details that hint on how much Baumeister understood the politics, but also criticized Ziegler and as well the art of the National Socialist, or the art that was favored by the National Socialist. The emphasizing on the pubic hair is actually an attack on Adolf Ziegler, who is nicknamed the Reichspubic hair painter, and who was not only the president of the Reichskulturkammer, the Reichschamber of Culture, but also one of the organizers of the exhibition Degenerate Art. So this is quite more than just a joke. And the humor of the postcard, which Baumeister used to send to good friends, and a look at his journal, which he extensively has used during the 1930s and 40s, document how well he was informed about the political events and especially about cultural politics. Another artist who seems to be like the epitome of the withdrawn artist is Hannah Höch. Many of you, when you know her, probably as one of the Dadaist artists, the Dada artist from Berlin, and her affiliation with the Berlin Dadaists, especially with Raoul Hausmann. And Hannah Höch lived in the 1920s for quite a few years in the Netherlands with her Dutch girlfriend. And she returned in the early 30s to Germany and was quite shocked how things had changed. And Hannah Höch was also one of the first ones to feel what was coming, or to see what was coming, because there was a solo exhibition planned at the Bauhaus in Dessau in 1932, and it was closed by the National Socialist authorities there, because the National Socialists at that time in the state of Thüringen were already in charge. And they also, there were also some attacks on modern art. And Hannah Höch was definitely one of the first one to learn about this and to have the disadvantaged side of this. So Hannah Höch in the late 1930s withdrew from her circle of friends, or the remaining circle of friends, and she moved to a house in Berlin-Heiligensee, which she bought in 1938, so at the outskirts of Berlin. And she only kept in contact with a few good friends. And but like Baumeister, she was not blind, or was not seeing what was happening around her, as we can see in her so-called Notzeitbilder, or the paintings or pictures of time of need, in which she depicts the consequences of war, in this case here on the way, especially people fleeing their homes, and also the certain death for a lot of people. However, her work did not allude to specific current events. Instead, it's more a timeless depiction of of the consequences of war, especially for the civilian population. Another artist who's been the topic of a talk recently is John Marman, also a Berlin-based artist who reacted to the National Socialist politics, cultural politics, in terms of both form and content. She, in the late 1930s, she gave up her style, which was affiliated to New Objectivity, a figurative style, a representative style, in favor of a cubist, clearly more aggressive style of painting. And some of her paintings, some of her works, moreover, also make a concrete reference to politics, like the painting Mackensen, which you can see here, an exaggerated portrait of the Prussian Generalfeldmarschall, so General Field Marshal August von Mackensen, who became very famous and very popular under the National Socialist regime, and in whom she caricatures in this portrait, and with him the militarism of the German Empire, which was then adopted by the National Socialist. One of my favorite works probably in the exhibition is this drawing by Werner Held. Werner Held is a very interesting case because he actually left Germany in 1933. He went to Spain, to Mallorca more specifically, and so he went into exile, but he had to leave Spain in 1935 because of the Spanish Civil War, and because the Germans supported the putschists. He had to leave the country, and he went back to Germany. Unfortunately, we don't know much about this entire process, if he was interested in, or if he was trying to go somewhere else, or if he went straight away back to Germany. But so this is also something up for more research. But yeah, it's very interesting because Held is actually, it's a failed exile, if you want to say so. And that's also a story that's not told so often. And Held is also pretty interesting because he's one of the few artists I know who explores in his works the phenomenon of the masses and the threat they pose. And in this work with the wonderful title Meeting, Parade of the Zeros, we see a homogeneous mass of people, which is only interspersed with a few flags and banners. But if we look closer, we can recognize that instead of faces, there are merely homogeneous zeros. And the march is somehow viewed from an interior space, although this is not very specified, but it seems like we're looking onto this march, this mass of people or zeros from somewhere above. And so we are like Held are the observer of this situation. And this also emphasizes to the feeling of isolation, and the accumulation of the zeros also expresses his unease regarding how easily masses can be mobilized and steered. And my last example is a quite famous one by Otto Dix, who is, of course, one of the most important painters of the Weimar period in the 1920s. And like Hofer and Baumeister, he lost his teaching position in 1933 in Dresden, and then went to the Swiss border, first to Ranbek and then to Hemmenhofen, where you can still find his house directly on the Lake Constance. And Dix is an interesting case because the defamation of his work and the dismission of his teaching position influenced both his life circumstances, but also the content of his work. And so because he's mostly known for his socio-critical depiction of the Weimar society. And yes, as of 1933, this topic disappears and changes into landscape and allegorical Christian topics. The landscape painting is, of course, something that was available. So the landscape was something available to Dix. He was surrounded by landscape, but it also provided him with a substantial market for selling his works. But nevertheless, the landscapes are not, as you can see here, not just simple representations of nature, but are instead characterized by a very ambiguous reading, which were often achieved by the means of natural phenomena or morbid influences, as we can see here in this painting, in the isolated trees, but also in these cloud-filled skies. And these elements, these means, fracture the very idyllic depiction of the landscape. And so these landscapes are not just depictions of reality, but they have, Dix follows in them a very specific aesthetic pattern that he uses to describe, also uses not only to describe the circumstances, his personal circumstances, the landscape that surrounds him, but also the overall political situation. But nevertheless, it's really hard in these paintings to really say, like, is this critical? Is this some kind of resistance in them? Because these paintings were often interpreted as acts of resistance. This painting, for example, the Jewish cemetery in Ranbek, is a very famous example, because this landscape, as we can see it, exists as it is. So this cemetery is still there, but of course, a lot of elements are very composed, and together they create this very morbid atmosphere. But still, what's also interesting is the year 1935, in which was depicted the year of the Nuremberg laws. I'm sorry. So yeah, here it's really, there are some hints that there's some more meaning in this landscapes, but it's really hard to exactly point them out. So to wrap this up, I think these examples, which are also in the exhibition. Oops, no, there's one left. So already show a little bit that the concept of inner immigration, but also the very shallow labeling of all the artists who stayed in Germany as degenerate or defamed, is quite problematic, because these terms often do not capture the different and very paradox careers and life realities of the artists who remained in Germany after 1933. And I would like to quote the art historian Christoph Zuschlag at the end of my lecture, because he phrased it very, very precisely. So besides a critical and differential look at this time, what is also necessary, as Christoph Zuschlag recently formulated, is, quote, the willingness to bid farewell to cherished myths and narratives handed down by art history, and to tolerate contradictions, discrepancies, ruptures, and fluid boundaries. End of quote, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ilka. This was very, very enlightening. Thank you, and very complex. And you touched upon a lot of very important topics that we could spend a lot of time talking about. And I think we have time for only very few questions.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Starting. No, that's fine. It was absolutely fascinating what you said. So one of the questions that came really early was whether the occupation ban barring an artist, whether it also barred an artist from working in the privacy of their home, meaning if their home was if they were caught making art in their own home, was that a violation, or was that not even a possibility because they didn't have material to create their own art?
Well, I mean, that's what the National Socialists actually tried to establish with the fact that you could only get material through the chamber. Mm-hmm. But we know for a fact that people worked at home or in the studios. So I really cannot answer this because I don't know of any case where someone was caught making art. So I cannot really say what the consequences would have been. So I would phrase it like this. So I don't know of any case where someone was imprisoned because of his art or was sent to a concentration camp or anything. So all the artists who were actually murdered by the National Socialists were either Jewish or communists. But definitely but the question is also how much the chamber or the Gestapo was like looking for artists who worked in private. And I think this was not really something that was really like one of their top priorities. Mm-hmm. But what they did is they established the system of fear and of fear of getting caught, because in a lot of the letters and journals, you can find this, you can find proof that many artists were actually scared. And the question is how much they were in danger actually. But I think for the National Socialists, it was in this case more important to establish the system of fear, and not so much of really catching artists who work in private. There are also the stories of the Gestapo searching studios, and it's always very, because a lot of these stories are from the post-war period. It's really hard to tell how true they are. But I know a couple of stories where it's very clear that it was not so much about the art. So the photographer and painter Edmund Kesting is a great case where his son always told the story that the Gestapo was not interested in the photos or in the paintings. They were looking for a press. So he had a printing press. And so they thought, okay, he's probably affiliated with some political group. So I think that was more the focus of such searches and not so much the art itself.
Yeah, thank you. So talking about the fear that was installed in artists, Joseph is asking, what happened to Kahufa's divorced wife?
Yeah, that's a long story, so I keep it quite short. His wife actually, so she left Berlin after they got a divorce. It was a quite long process because she had to say yes to this divorce, and she refused this for quite a long time. But Hofer convinced her, and after that she left Germany, went to Wiesbaden. And there she lived until 1943, when she was deported and murdered in Auschwitz. And so, yeah, this is a story which is quite known in the literature around Hofer, but the literature so far is quite apologetic around this story, saying that Hofer couldn't see this coming in 1938, which I think is in part true, but also he lived in Berlin, so he must have witnessed a lot of atrocities against the Jewish population. And also he definitely put his own career, his own forthcoming before his wife, which is kind of sad because he had no career at this time. So it was a little bit, so the question is, what is he protecting? And so just for the background, it could have been, so of course this is in the area of speculation, but his wife could have survived the National Socialist regime if they had stayed married, maybe. because the marriage between a Jewish person and a non-Jewish person was considered a privileged mixed marriage. So there were certain advantages to that. So he could have protected her, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm I doubt that he didn't know what would happen to his wife. But the question is, Linda is asking whether he had children.
Yes, he had 2 sons. Mm-hmm. Both survived the war, and both were not deported or anything with it, which is also interesting. And since there is not much research on the families, it's hard to say what the reasons were why the sons were never imprisoned and never deported. Mm-hmm. But the sons were already older; they were already adults, so there were no small children at that time.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Another question to a specific artist that you didn't speak about, Franz Gratzev, mm-hmm. Who's also part of that of your exhibition. He was an SA member, and as such replaced Paul Klee at the Düsseldorf Academy, who was considered an artist. And could you tell us, and I know we don't have much time, but could you give us an idea why did you include him into the exhibition? And that leads to the last question, and people have really enjoyed your presentation. How did you select the artists in the exhibition?
Okay, first Franz Gratzev. So of course I wanted at least one. I mean, Kahufa is also an interesting case, but I wanted someone who was also affiliated with the NSDAP in the show. Emil Nolde would have been an obvious choice, but after the exhibition in Berlin, I thought maybe I'm skipping him and giving space to someone else. And Franz Gratzev is an interesting case because his life shows a lot of similarities to Nolde. So he was a member of the NSDAP. And as the person who asked the question mentioned, he benefited from the National Socialist regime because he got the position of Paul Klee at the Düsseldorf Kunstakademie. But he was dismissed after a couple of years when his early expressionist works were discovered, but also for other reasons. This was more something that was put in front in the process. And so he lost his position, and then he moved back to Dangast, to the North Shore of Germany, to the far north, where he actually became, that's hard to translate, Kreisreichsstellenleiter für Kunst. So it was he was kind of a local authority, someone who would organize exhibitions and take care of certain cultural affairs. And I found this really interesting because on the one hand, we have a person who is in some ways defamed by the public. So when he got dismissed from his position, his early works were presented, and it was of course, his art was called degenerate, and he was. This would happen very publicly. So, and then when he went to the countryside, this was somehow forgotten. And because of his good relationships to the people there, to the authorities there, he was able to kind of adjust and. Although he was not really able to show his works in exhibitions because Franz Gratzev actually had a ban for solo exhibitions, he was able to lead a quite stable life. And I found his example quite interesting because he shows again, like others, that this whole system, the National Socialist cultural politics are based on, is quite weak and inconsistent, and it depended really on the circumstances you were living in, if you were able to adjust or not. So that was the reason why I wanted him into the show, although I got a lot of criticism for that, I have to admit. And the other thing was that, yeah, the selection in general. Well, so when I decided to do it by biographies, it was clear that I could only show a handful of artists instead of many, many. And so my goal was to find a selection that has a variety of biographies of attitudes towards the system. So on one hand, Gratzev, for example, and then on the other end of the spectrum, someone like Lea Grundig, who was Jewish and a communist. And on the other hand, it was also important for the selection to have a variety of materials, a variety of mediums, so that it's not just an exhibition of small brown drawings, because that was the fear at the Schirn. So my colleagues were always like, hopefully it's not all very teeny tiny and dark and gloomy. But as you can see here with the works by Jan Marman, I mean, that's something that's astonishing in general, that such large works were created in this time. And that's, I think, really, really interesting. So yeah, but I can say, I could do this show again with a selection of completely different artists, I would say. Some are quite necessary for this time period, but there are many, many other artists who I would have loved to show. But another thing that's probably, and then I'm finished with talking, is that it was also necessary to find artists who created a substantial body of work in this period. And that's not the case for everyone. So that excluded, of course, a lot of Jewish artists who were not able to work at all because of the circumstances. So Franz Ascher is, of course, an example for a biography like that. But we also have artists who really, who either completely stopped working and did something else, or artists who were not able to work, who really produced a teeny tiny number of works because the circumstances made it impossible for them to work, not, I would say, on a when it comes to the means, but like on a more emotional level or creative level. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ilka. I have the feeling this is not the end of the discussion, rather beginning. And I'm now spilling the beans because starting August 1st, Dr. Ilka Voermann will be head of prints and drawings at Berlinische Galerie in Berlin, Germany. So congratulations, Ilka. I very much look forward to seeing the exhibitions that you will curate in that new position. And in the meantime, I encourage those who live in Frankfurt or are visiting before June 6th to see the exhibition Art for No One, 1933 to 1945 at Schirn Kunsthalle in Frankfurt. Thank you so much. And the comments are pouring in, very interesting. Thank you for your eye-opening presentation, and thank you so much for sharing your research here. So thank you and congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm glad everyone enjoyed it.
Thank you, and all the best to everyone. And I'm looking forward to get together again. Thank you. All the best.
Thank you.